Hey, what's going on, guys? Miles BERRIO. Welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to talk about buying a rental property when there is a tenant actually still in the property. So there's a couple of things to really think about, and it's a process that I've gone through a couple of times, and it can be a little interesting. So I wanted to just share a video with you guys on a couple of steps and things to just think about. So first of all, if you're buying a property with a tenant already in the property, you have to consider really the needs and the desires of the owner, because let's just say from step one, right? You're interested in this property that has a tenant, and you want to go view the property. You want to check out the conditions and things like that. Typically, you have to work with the owner, obviously. It's not like if it's just a vacant property, you can kind of just go to the property whenever and go take a look at it. But if there's a tenant in place, you have to obviously schedule with the owner when that would make sense, because the owner has to reach out to the tenant. Now, these are just things you may not think about until you're in the situation, but sometimes you might have an owner that hasn't really communicated to the tenant that he's selling or she is selling the property. So they don't really want to sort of spoof the tenant that they're selling them or kind of get them worried. So you basically have to kind of pretend to be someone else while you go look at the property. So I know it's not necessarily maybe the biggest deal, but it's just something to think about. It kind of happens. So I've been a insurance adjuster looking at repairs and, all types of individuals as you go look at the property. So just know that that is something that could come up to where the owner does not want to spoof the tenant. So you just let them know, hey, I can still go look at the property, but not necessarily like I'm, looking to purchase it. I'll just let the tenant know that I'm like an insurance adjuster or whatever the case may be. That'll maybe put the owner a little bit at ease when you're looking at this property. Before we even go look at the property, let's talk about how you can actually buy a property with a tenant in place and it be a win-win situation for everyone. It's actually one of the ways that I pitch creative finance to an owner, is essentially just saying, hey, look, you are getting monthly rent from the tenant already. Now, we both understand that that's gross. So you're having to take out property taxes, insurance, repairs, because you manage the property, et cetera. What if I could put you in a position where I just pay you every single month net income like the bank, and you don't pay property taxes or property insurance like the bank, or manage the property or get phone calls like the bank? I would love to elevate you to like the bank and just pay you on a monthly basis. So essentially what I'm talking about, guys, is seller finance. But I don't really talk about seller finance in the way that other people may talk about it to sellers or owners and say seller finance or subject to, or, wrap mortgage or whatever the creative finance terms you can find out there. I typically stray away from saying the terminology because it can kind of confuse people. And I call them like trigger words. They might have heard someone say, seller financing or owner financing, and it makes them just, they get a little weirded out about it, right? So what I like to do is just talk about the benefits of that particular strategy, and that just tends to work out much better. So anyway, if there's a tenant in place, I just kind of communicate to them, hey, this is a win-win situation for everyone, because ultimately, I don't want to buy the property and then have to kick the tenant out, right? Because see, if I pay cash for this property, because I have so much cash tied up into this, I really need to get a certain return, and I'm probably going to have to move this tenant out immediately. So this is one of the best ways that we can do this, where it's a win-win for everyone. You can mitigate your tax liability, because instead of coming to the table with a ton of cash, I'll come to the table with a lot less. So you pay a lot less in taxes, but I can actually buy the property for more than you would talking to someone who's trying to pay cash and they're going to negotiate you, et cetera. So that makes the owner kind of feel like, oh, wow, I can sell my property for more. I can take a little bit of cash at closing, so I can pay less in taxes that tax year, and then just finance out the rest of the property. But do it in a way where I'm not having to, pay property taxes, pay property insurance, be responsible for the property anymore, get phone calls, any of that, because they are no longer going to do that. They sold the property. Now I'm the new owner. You would be the new owner, and that would be your responsibility. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it allows you to structure the payment to the seller based on what the tenants are paying right now. Now, I've done this before, and it's been awesome, because essentially what happens is we all know that mortgage payments stay the same. Right? The mortgage payments stay the same, but what always goes up over time, no matter what, even if you're buying a property in the most ghetto of the ghetto, we definitely know if you bought in the most ghetto of the ghetto 20 years ago, if it's still ghetto today, it's probably going to still be worth more than it did 20 years ago, and the rent is going to be more as well. So I like to structure deals based on what the tenants are paying right now, because it allows me to keep the tenant in place. because they're already paying rent, and now my mortgage payment to the seller won't exceed that. And then on top of that, the seller gets their benefit, right? Lower tax liability, get to sell the property for higher. And then for me, I can buy a property creatively without having to go to the bank, pull tax returns, debt to income ratio, all those things, because now I'm just focused on creating, creative financing structure with the seller where they become the bank for me and finance the property. So that's a really unique way, but it's a really powerful way to be able to buy a property with a tenant already in the property. Now, let's kind of move past that. Let's just say if you were able to do creative finance, that's one way to go. But let's say you can't do creative finance and, it just won't work. You have to buy the property cash. Let's just say the owner wants the property sold for cash, and that's really your only option. Well, there's two things that you have to really think about if you're going to buy a property as a rental property and the tenant is already in place. Number one is you have to understand what the lease agreement is like. So there's two types of leases that you'll generally find when buying a rental property. It'll either be month to month or it'll be a long-term lease. And I'll generally ask the owner, is this tenant on a month to month or is this like a long-term lease? Because this is what's important. If it's on a month to month lease, there's some flexibility in terms of when you buy the property, or even before you buy it, what can happen. Meaning, if a tenant's on a month-to-month lease, now of course you want to check with your jurisdiction, your county, how many days of notice a tenant needs is kind of different in different states and different areas. So you want to figure that out. Like I know this because I'm doing a deal in Augusta, Georgia. I live in South Carolina, but I'm doing a deal virtually. I'm buying a rental property in Georgia, and if the tenant is on a month-to-month lease or does not have a lease, and I think really even in general, you have to give the tenant 60-day notice to vacate the property, not 30 days. Some places you can just give them 30 days. So you just want to figure out what that actually is, because you don't want that to turn around and bite you when you are maybe going through some sort of I don't want to say lawsuit, but maybe you're having to go to court for something like an eviction or whatever. You want to make sure you follow the rules in terms of what they've laid out in that area. So you're buying the property, there's a tenant in place. You've asked the seller, hey, is this tenant on a month-to-month lease or a long-term lease? Now, if they're on a month-to-month lease, generally, again, based on the amount of days that you have to give the tenant notice, you don't have to renew the lease when those days are up. So essentially what will happen is, let's just say in a particular area, you have to just give the tenant 30 days notice to be able to vacate the property. Well, when you give that, let's say you buy the property and give them 30 days notice. Well, that next month, you don't actually have to renew their lease. You've given them 30 days notice and you've let them know, hey, next month, we're not actually renewing the lease because, we're going a different route. We're doing this or we're doing that. You don't necessarily have to have a whole explanation. You've done your part of just letting the tenant know, hey, unfortunately, we're not going to be renewing the lease next month. We're, giving you a 30 days notice. Now, some people might go, oh man, dude, that sucks for the tenant. Like, 30 days, you buy the property and now you're kicking the tenant out. Well, if they're on a month-to-month lease, they've actually kind of already signed up for that. And it's actually, it's sort of mutually beneficial, right? Because if I'm a landlord, property owner, and I have a month-to-month lease with my tenant, it actually makes it more flexible for me to, again, just say, hey, next month, we're not renewing the lease, and give them the adequate amount of days that they need to have notice and to vacate the property. So it allows for there to be a much more fluid and more flexible way of dealing with the property. Whereas if they're on a long-term lease, you just have to honor that lease. Now, the same goes for the actual tenant. If the tenant, they know that they're not on a long-term lease, there may be a time where you've rented somewhere and you're like on a 12-month lease, but then maybe something happens where you need to move or, I don't know, just something to where, you really don't want to have to honor that lease, but you have to. You're in a 12-month unless you have to pay this, huge fee to break the lease. But see, if you're on a month-to-month, you can just let the landlord know with the right amount of time that you're supposed to let them know that, hey, next month I'm actually not going to, or the next 60 days, I'm finding a new place where I have to move, etc. So it makes it more flexible for everyone. And anyone on a month-to-month lease, they actually already understand that, and that's that. But if they're on a month-to-month lease, you want to just go through that process to give them the day's notice, and then essentially you make the decision on whatever you want to do after that. But if they're on a long-term lease and you're buying a property with a tenant that's on a long-term lease, you actually have to honor that lease. Just because the ownership changes, it doesn't mean that the terms that the tenant agreed to change. It's just the ownership change. So that's something that I had to learn when I first got started in real estate. I was like, man, if someone's going to buy this property with the tenant already there, Like how does that really work? Well, it works in the fact that whether you were there or not, the lease is still in place. The lease is the lease. It's upheld. It's a contract that would be upheld in court. You have to honor that lease. So whenever that lease expires, then you can make the decision to do whatever it is that you are trying to do. Now, that's if you're buying a property with a tenant in place. We talked about if they're on a month-to-month lease, you can even go under contract with the seller, but then you can have the closing be 30 days out and just have the seller give the tenant a 30-day notice so that when you close, the property's vacant, if that is what you're wanting, or 60 days. Again, if you're in an area where it needs 60 days, you can set the closing out that. So we've talked about out that far. So we've talked about if the tenant is in place and they're on a month-to-month lease, you can go under contract with the seller, set the closing to be at the length of time for them to vacate so that when you do close, they have that time and they vacate. Or you buy the property if you can't wait that long, and then you give them the certain amount of notice for them to vacate, and then you make your decision after that. But if they're in a long-term lease, we talked about you have to honor that long-term lease because that is still an agreement that has nothing to do about the ownership changing. They sign that agreement. They have the right to stay there. Now, what if you're in an interesting situation like I'm in right now? Again, like I said earlier, I am buying a property out in Augusta, Georgia, and the situation is a little interesting. So we'll kind of talk about this, right? So the tenant is actually in the property, right? So I actually could not do the strategy I just talked about where I would have loved to just say, hey, let's set the closing 2 months out, because in Georgia, you have to give them 60-day notice. Hey, we'll set the closing, 60 days out. So by the time we close, they've been given enough time to vacate. They've been given the notice to vacate, and then I'll be good. Well, that can't happen because it's kind of a sticky situation where part of the ownership or the owner of the property essentially has some health issues, and who would be managing their estate and everything like that. They're really kind of worried that if he passes away, the whole property is going to have to go through a probate situation, and that could just be really, really complicated. So essentially, when someone owns a property, they're like the single owner and they own a property and then they pass away and there's no will in place, then that property generally goes through what's called a probate process. And we're not going to necessarily go through the whole concept of what probate is. You can, I'll do a video explaining that, or you can just go look it up. But it's essentially it can be a very lengthy process and a little complicated. So, and the property can't actually be sold or funds be collected really until that process has been settled, et cetera. So to avoid that, they're like, hey, we really need to sell. We just want to sell this so it's sold. The funds are dispersed. Everything's good to go. If anything, unfortunately were to happen, the property has already been sold. So I pretty much have to close on this property. This is happening literally right now. So in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to have to close on this property. So I have to close on this property in the next 2 weeks, but there's a tenant in the property. And we just gave the tenant today a 60-day notice. But that means I have to close on it with the tenant there in the property. Now, what is the lease agreement like? So the tenant does not have a long-term lease. The tenant also doesn't have a month-to-month lease. They have no lease agreement. So unfortunately, there are some times where you have these sort of mom and pop investors that don't really have the right documentation. They don't really do their job, to be professional about running their business. And there's like there's no documents, there's no lease, there's nothing. So what do you do when there's a tenant in the property and there's no lease agreement? They're not on long-term or month-to-month. Really, there's only two options for me. And this is kind of what we'll talk about if you're in this situation. A, you have to just go through an eviction. You give them the notice that they are required to have to vacate. But if they still don't vacate, then you do have to go through an eviction process, which could take another month, 2 months, however many months based on your area and how that works. But the other option is to do what's called cash for keys. Now, there's two ways you can really do cash for keys. Some people will do cash for keys where they'll just pay that person money to vacate. Now, that person may take that, right? Like, especially if they're behind in rent. A lot of times that works for someone who's like behind on their rent, and maybe they're behind like $2,000 or $1,500 or whatever. And there's an eviction process going on, and you're about to buy this property because the seller's like, I'm just done with this. I don't want to deal with this anymore. And you can buy this property at a great price. Again, it's called a motivated seller. It's a way that you can basically buy real estate for very cheap because the seller just doesn't want to deal with it anymore. But now it's your problem, right? So cash for keys allows you to say, hey, look, I know you're trying to stay in this property. You're behind on the rent. The owner's demanding this rent and you're not paying the rent. And there's this whole process. What if I just gave you $2,000? Would you, be willing to just leave? And you'd be surprised some of these individuals, because a lot of times if they're not paying their rent, it's because they're struggling financially. So they might be willing to take $2,000 or $1,500. And you might be like, man, I don't want to pay $1,500. Well, first of all, that's negotiable, right? I mean, you could give them, give them $500 or $700 or whatever the case may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be 15 or 200. But basically, it may make more sense and less expensive than having to deal with a whole entire going to court, hiring an attorney, going through an eviction process, the time, the money you're not making once you close, all the headache, all the stuff that goes with buying that property. It might make sense to just write a check for $500, $700 or $1,000 to have them just leave. Now, funny enough, again, in my case, the tenant basically had said, hey, I don't want your money, right? And he's been paying his rent. And although his rent, he's been only paying like $400 a month. So it's like an older gentleman who's been paying like $400 a month. Market rent's like $1,300. So that, that's great because again, I'm able to buy this property at a very cheap price, compared to what the actual overall value would be once we fix it up. So it'll be a nice little refinance, buy and hold. But also there's a good bit of value add in terms of the rents increasing for income as well. But again, I have to deal with this challenge, right? And you'll find in real estate, a lot of the best deals are dealing with solving problems that a lot of people don't want to have to solve. A lot of people pass up on this deal because again, the tenant was in there and didn't have a lease and couldn't close on it vacant, all this stuff, right? So the guy didn't want my money, right? I was honestly gonna just give him $1,500, but he didn't want it. So the only other way for Cash the Keys is to work is for me to actually find a rental for that person to move into. And then instead of just giving the tenant just money, just cash money, you actually pay the other landlord, you pay for the security deposit and first month's rent for that tenant. So instead of handing the money to the actual person, you go ahead and solidify and financially set up the rental for them to actually move into. So that can be a really, really great option because you're not just giving the money to the tenant and hoping that they do what they were supposed to do with it or that they leave. You're literally securing a property saying, hey, you can actually move to this right now. And I'm actually going to pay first month's rent and security deposit for it, right? So that's kind of where I'm at right now is I'm in the middle. I'm securing this rental. I've already talked to a landlord. It's like $650 a month. It's a 1-bedroom. It's like a studio. It's in I think it's a 9-unit apartment complex. And there's all these different studios and 2-bedroom baths or whatever. I basically looked online, reached out, and I'm calling the tenant tomorrow to kind of let them know the options. Hey, this is what we're doing. We're trying to find a place. But he already knows his 60-day notice time has been started. Now, just based off of his character, I don't really imagine he's going to like try to just stay and we have to go through the whole eviction. But this is the last thing I'll say is if you do have to go through the eviction process, the reason why I was able to move forward is because I calculated what this cost and the time would be. So I spent like 30 minutes on the phone with the magistrate court in Augusta because before you move into that deal or you buy that deal, you want to make sure you talk to the courts to know exactly how this eviction, if you were to do eviction, is going to be. Whether you think the person's going to have to be evicted or not, you want to know exactly worst case scenario. Long story short, I know that I have to give them 2 months notice in advance. So let's say right now, January, I give them 2 months notice. They don't leave. I go to the courts and I file an eviction and essentially a sheriff will come out and serve them and they'll have 7 days to respond. If they do respond, a court date will be set. If they don't respond, then essentially there is there's what's called execution of writ or writ of execution. And essentially it legally allows for the court to literally, you basically get escorted with the sheriff and they just literally remove the person. But that essentially would happen if they did not respond. But if he does respond and tries to fight the eviction, then they set the court date, which generally can be anywhere between 2 to 3 or 4 weeks out. That's what they said. So basically about another month. So I know that I have 3 months worst case scenario of basically tying this thing up and dealing with this worst case. But the private money that I borrowed to buy the property to fix it up as well and then refinance is a 6-month loan. And then I also worked with my contractor, my GC, to figure out how long it would take to get the work that we know needs to get done in about a month and a half to max about 2 months. Even worst case, if it took 3 months, I know that after that, basically worst case scenario of 3 months of going through the eviction, I have another 3 months to get the property done. And that's worst case if we actually go through the full eviction process. So understanding exactly how the eviction works, understanding what your options are, understanding the worst case scenario, it's really, really imperative if you're going to be buying a property with a tenant in place. So anyway, guys, just wanted to share that with you. Again, just to recap, if you're buying a property with a tenant in place, you got to understand whether it's a long-term lease or a short-term lease. If it's long-term, you have to honor that lease. If it's short-term, then you can either set the closing date to be the time that you give them notice with the seller before you close, or you close on it and then give the tenant that time of notice. Now, if they don't want to leave, you do have to go through the eviction process. But if you don't want to have to go through eviction process, you can encourage them by doing cash for keys. And there's kind of two ways you can do that, obviously. You could do cash for keys by just obviously giving them money, or you can actually solidify a rental for them to move into and kind of make it a little bit more amicable. So hopefully that helped you and made sense. If you have any questions about that, reach out, and I'll see you guys in the next video.